So hello everyone, welcome to the second day of our course, A Brief Introduction to Group Theory. I hope that you have solved the assignments, the graded ones as well as the non-graded ones, and have submitted it on time. So by solving it, I hope that you also have got quite a grasp on the definition of groups, subgroups, and related terminologies, which we have dealt with, so on. I hope you have also gone through the video or parts of it once again if you had some doubts even after the question answer session last day. So now let's start with day 2. So let's recall what we did in the first class. Firstly, we revisited set theory briefly. So we studied what sets are, functions are, operations are, relations are, and so on, equivalence relations, partitions, whatever is required for a study of group theory. We defined groups and subgroups and dealt with them. We defined order and studied its properties. We saw the cyclic subgroup or the cyclic group in general. We saw three examples: the example of matrices, the example of modular arithmetic, and the example of symmetric group. Also, if you have seen the appendix video, we have studied a bit more of cyclic group, and I've also seen what finitely generated groups are, what finitely generated subgroups are, and also direct products. You have also seen the direct product in the assignment. Today's first topic is a study of subgroups and also an introduction to some special types of subgroups generated or containing an element. So now let's look at the subgroup proposition or an equivalent condition for a subset to be a subgroup. Let P be a subset of a group G, then P is a subgroup of G if and only if P contains the identity and for all P, Q belonging to P, PQ inverse is an element of P. So let's prove it. Clearly, if P is a subgroup of G, we have this straight away by the definition of subgroups. Now for the converse, suppose for all P, Q belonging to P, PQ inverse belongs to P. We first show that it's closed under inverses. Suppose G belongs to P, then set P is equal to 1 and Q is equal to G. Then we know that 1 is in the subset P, so we can use it. So G inverse belongs to P, and it turns out that P is closed under inverses. Now if A, B belongs to P, then our previous fact that P is closed under inverses would say that B inverse is also an element of P. So set P is equal to A and Q is equal to B inverse. It turns out that AB by this definition belongs to P. So P is also closed under composition. So indeed, P being closed under composition or multiplication as well as inverses and also containing the identity is the same as saying P is a subgroup of G. So we also have a proposition over here which is somewhat similar to this but a bit more general. It says that P is a subgroup if and only if P is non-empty. Note that over here we haven't assumed that P contains 1, but that would follow from our assumption that P is non-empty and it satisfies this property that PQ inverse belongs to P for all P, Q belonging to P. This is a part of your exercise. So now let's look into intersections and unions of subgroups. Let G be a group and suppose P and Q are subgroups of G. Then we define R as the intersection of P and Q. Our claim is that R is a subgroup of G. Clearly 1 is an element of P and 1 is an element of Q, so 1 is an element of R. As 1 is both in P and Q and R is the intersection of P and Q. So suppose P and Q are elements of R. Then as R is a subset of P as well as Q, you get P and Q are elements of P as well as Q. But P and Q are subgroups. So our subgroup proposition in the previous slide implies PQ inverse is an element of PQ. So PQ inverse is in P intersection Q or R. So by subgroup proposition, R turns out to be a subgroup of G. So now let's look at unions. Suppose S is P union Q and satisfies that S is a subgroup of G. Then our claim is that this can hold if and only if P is a subset of Q or Q is a subset of P. The converse is trivial, as if P is a subset of Q or Q is a subset of P, their union is either Q or P, and so S turns out to be a subgroup. So suppose that S is a subgroup now, and P is not contained in Q. So there is an element of P which is not a part of Q. So we have P minus Q means the set of elements which are in P but not in Q. Suppose Q is an element of Q, then PQ belongs to S, as S is a subgroup. But PQ belongs to Q would imply P belongs to Q, which is not true. As PQ belongs to Q and Q is a subgroup, so Q inverse belongs to Q, then post multiplying by Q inverse says PQ Q inverse belongs to Q or P belongs to Q. This is not true. Hence, PQ belongs to P, but then P belongs to P. So P inverse is also an element of P, as P is a subgroup. The P inverse PQ is an element of P. So P inverse P is 1, so it turns out Q is an element of P. Hence, Q is a subset of P. And our claim was true. So now let's look at a special subgroup of G called the center. The center of G is defined as a set of all elements which commute with all other elements in G. So the center, denoted as ZG, is defined as a set of all A in G such that AG is equal to GA for all G belonging to G. Can you show that the center is a subgroup of G which is abelian? See, the abelian part is not difficult, as these elements in ZG commute with all elements in G, so they will also commute with all elements in ZG. But the challenge over here is to show that it's a subgroup. Try it out. We'll try to do this in another way after a few slides. Now we have an obvious conclusion. A group G is abelian if and only if G is equal to ZG. So if G is abelian, then all elements commute with each other. So G is equal to ZG. And if G is equal to ZG, then all elements of G commute with each other, and that's the definition of G being abelian. So now we define the centralizer of an element A. The centralizer of an element A, denoted as ZA, is the set of all elements G which commute with A, that is AG is equal to GA. Now we prove that this is a subgroup. Clearly 1 is an element of ZA, as 1A is equal to A1. So suppose P and Q are elements of the centralizer. Then look at this chain of equalities which says that PQA is indeed APQ. So PQ is also an element of ZA. Similarly, one can show that P inverse is also an element of ZA if P is an element of ZA. So indeed our claim was true and ZA is a subgroup. Now we look at the old result in a new look. The result of intersection and of center being a subgroup. Let QL be a family of subgroups of G, then their intersection, defined as R, turns out to be a subgroup. Previously we proved this for two subgroups, and that was easy, and by induction we can extend it to a finite collection of subgroups. But over here by family it can be infinite and even uncountable. So try to prove this. The proof is similar, but you can't use that result directly. You have to use the technique of the proof. Now, once we have proven this, can you show that ZG, the center, is basically the intersection of all centralizers? This isn't hard to show, as one inclusion is obvious. Think of the other inclusion. So if you can show these two facts, use these two together to get that ZG is indeed a subgroup. These are not tough but shall require some patience and a good understanding, and I shall give a verbal hint after a minute. You can pause the video and try it out. I am giving the hint. So the hint over here is for the intersection you use the same proof, and for the ZG part try to show that each centralizer contains ZG. This is not hard to show, and this intersection must lie inside ZG, the opposite inclusion. So try it out, or you can go ab initio by definitions. Now can you indeed use these two theorems and the basic definition of ZG to show that it's an abelian subgroup? Yes, now it becomes a bit easier, and this is a more general approach. So now let's define conjugate elements. Again, A is an element of G, and B, an element of G, is said to be a conjugate of A in G. The group is important. If there exists some element G of G such that GA G inverse is equal to B. Look that we are doing GA G inverse. We are multiplying by G, pre-multiplying and post-multiplying by the inverse of G. Why are they called conjugates? Because they behave a bit similarly. We'll soon see a few properties. We shall represent it as A is conjugate of B, also as B is equal to AG to specify by which element B and A are conjugates. So B equal to AG if B is equal to GA G inverse. Indeed, A is conjugate to A as A is equal to 1A 1 inverse, and A is conjugate to B implies B is conjugate to A as B is equal to GA G inverse implies A is equal to G inverse BG, but G is equal to G inverse whole inverse. So this says A is equal to BG inverse. Also on similar lines, one can show that A is a conjugate of B and B is a conjugate of C implies A is a conjugate of C. Hence, conjugacy is an equivalence relation justifying the notation which looks like an equivalence relation over here, and the equivalence classes are called conjugacy classes. The conjugacy class containing A is written as C of A, a stylized C with A instead of the regular box notation. Now we look at some properties of conjugates. As I said, two conjugates behave similarly. The first thing is that the order of the conjugates are the same. That is, OA is equal to OB. Suppose A power n is equal to 1. That's if and only if G A power n G inverse is equal to 1. This is easy to see. But G A power n G inverse is basically G A G inverse whole power n, which is B. So A power n is equal to 1 if and only if B power n is equal to 1. Hence, their orders are the same. One is defined if the other is defined, and the orders, if defined, are the same. The next property says that A is in the center if and only if the conjugacy class of A is a singleton, that is A itself. This is easy to see, as if it's A itself, then GA G inverse is equal to A because it's in the conjugacy class and there is no other element other than A over here. So GA G inverse is equal to A for all G, so GA is equal to AG. And A commutes with all G, and A commutes with all G's, hence it's in the center. In an assignment, we'll show that the conjugacy class of A has an order dividing the order of the group. Now, the set of elements which satisfy B such that A is equal to BA B inverse is basically the centralizer of A. So this and this implies that an element is in the centralizer. So this fact, along with the fact that A is in center, implies that the conjugacy class is a singleton, says that an element is in the center if and only if ZA is equal to ZG. This is also easy to see directly. Now we come to the notion of conjugate subgroups. Like conjugate elements, there are conjugate subgroups as well. So define G A G inverse, this thing, as the set of all G at G inverses such that H belong to H and G is fixed. So indeed one can show that this H prime, which is equal to G H G inverse, is a subgroup. Try it. Now let H and H prime be lesser than equal to G or subgroups of G. We say H is congruent or conjugate of H prime if there exists some element of G such that H prime is a conjugate of H with respect to that element, or H prime is equal to G H G inverse. Again, it turns out that this conjugacy of subgroups is an equivalence relation. So try to prove it using our concepts before. And the equivalence classes are again called conjugacy classes, but the notation differs a bit. Over there was a single element, and now we would write it as the stylized C with the subscript of this name of the subgroup, as CH for example. So let's now define a special type of subgroup called the normal subgroup. Earlier we saw that if the conjugacy class is a singleton for an element, it's an element of ZG, and this is an if and only if condition. But what if the conjugacy class of a subgroup is a singleton? That is G inverse is equal to H for all G. This question leads us to define a very important class of subgroup called the normal subgroup. If this holds that G inverse is equal to H for all G, we say H is a normal subgroup of G and denote it as H, a triangle with a bar below G, or a triangle equal to G. It might seem that we are defining a lot of things, and this thing, defining a normal group, is not that important right now, but the strength of it shall be realized when we discuss quotient groups soon. As an example, note that if H is less than equal to ZG, then G inverse is equal to H for all G belonging to G and H belonging to H. So any subgroup of the center is indeed normal. So any subgroup of the center is indeed normal. Now we define centralizers for a subgroup and normalizers for it. The centralizer of H in G is defined as the set of all elements which commute with all elements in H. So the centralizer ZH is defined as G belonging to G such that AG is equal to GA for all A in H. So it's basically the intersection of the centralizers of all elements of H. So now what about the conjugation of subgroups and the set of elements which fix H? That is G inverse is equal to H. If H is normal, we get the whole group is if H is normal, it turns out that this set is the whole group. But what if H is not normal? We call this as the normalizer of H and denote as a NH. NH is equal to G belonging to G such that G inverse is equal to H, or G fixes H in the conjugation map. So clearly if H is an element of H, then H belongs to NH because H inverse turns out to be H. Also there might be additional elements, and as I said, for normal subgroups NH turns out to be the whole of G. We have already seen that ZH is a subgroup of G. But what about NH? Again, NH turns out to be a subgroup. NH turns out to be a subgroup of G. But it has a special property. NH is the largest subgroup of G containing H such that H is normal in NH. The fact that H is normal in NH was easy by the definition, but to prove that it's the largest subgroup of G requires a bit of work. First of all, 1 is an element of NH, and as 1H, 1 inverse is equal to H. Again, if A and B are elements of NH, then AB turns out to be an element of NH. So indeed, NH turns out to be a subgroup. Clearly, as we discussed, by definition, H is normal in NH. So suppose H is normal in J, which is a subgroup of G. Then by the definition, it turns out that J is a subgroup of NH. And now we know that NH is a group, so it turns out J is a subgroup of NH, not just a subset. So indeed, a claim that it's the largest subgroup of G containing H and H is normal in NH is true. So this supports a fact to say that H is normal in G if and only if NH is equal to G. So now we come to an example of these special subsets or subgroups using S3. Suppose X is the map 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 3 and 3 goes to 1. And Y is the map 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 1 and 3 is fixed. Capital X is the cyclic group generated by small x and capital Y is the cyclic group generated by small y. Note that S3 is equal to this set, and under the group operation, clearly yx square is equal to xy, which we already proved, which is not equal to yx. Yxy is not equal to yx. That is x square y. Suppose xy is equal to y, that would imply x is equal to identity from these two. That's not true. But x square y is not equal to yxy. Why? Yx, and this is yx times y. This is not true. But yxy is equal to x square. This is a chain of inequalities and equalities which would say that x square and y are not elements of ZG. In fact, if you look closely, this also says that xy and x square y are also not elements of ZG. But you don't need to prove it specifically. Note that y is just one map which fixes one element and moves the other two. It turns out that the other two maps which does this property are basically xy and x square y. So we could have chosen one of them to be y instead of this. So y, xy and x square y in S3 behave quite similarly. So indeed they also cannot belong to ZG as y does not belong to ZG. So the only element in ZG is 1 and ZG is the singleton identity. Note that Zx and Zx square are capital X. Because x commutes with 1x and x square, similarly x square commutes with 1x and x square, but it does not commute with y, xy or x square y. And zy is equal to y. So by intersection law, zx is equal to the intersection of the whole group, which is the centralizer for identity, with x, which is the centralizer for x and x square. So zx is equal to x and zy is equal to y, as is the intersection of g with y. In general, for any element, note that the subgroup generated by that element is a part of the centralizer, or rather a subgroup of the centralizer. This is quite simple to show. Now, x is less than equal to nx. This is true, right? We have already seen that the normalizer of any subgroup contains the subgroup itself. Also, y1 y inverse or 1 subscript y is equal to 1 xy or yxy inverse is equal to x square, and x square subscript y or y x square y inverse is equal to x. So y belongs to capital X as it sends all of its elements to x, and indeed y capital X y inverse with these equalities turn out to be capital X. In fact, one can show that g is equal to nx using the fact that the order of x divides the order of g. Indeed, not just this, we would use a stronger result which follows from this, that order of nx or the normalizer of x also divides the order of g, which we shall see soon as nx is a subgroup. Indeed, for any subgroup, the order of that subgroup divides the order of the group if it's finite. Or you can prove it directly that g is equal to nx. We have already shown it for y, and we know xy and x square y behave similarly to y. Just try to show that it also respects the fact and preserves x under conjugation. Now what about ny? This is an exercise for you. But just to simplify the exercise, I will be stating the answer. It's y. Just y. No other element lies in the normalizer. In the following section, we'll briefly study about cosets and Lagrange's theorem. So what exactly are cosets? Let G be a group and H be a subgroup of it. Then the set A capital H is defined as the set of all elements AH such that H is an element of capital H. This set is called a coset, or specifically a left coset, because A is towards the left of H. Note that AH is equal to H implies that A times 1 is an element of H, which is if and only if A belongs to H. As 1 is an element of H, this holds. In fact, the converse also holds. So indeed one can show that AH is equal to H if and only if A is an element of H. Now note that for all A belonging to G, A is an element of the coset AH. But looking at this reminds us a bit about equivalence relations. So can cosets determine something like an equivalence relation? First of all, let's see it's well defined. So suppose AH is equal to BH. So what's the condition for two cosets of two different elements to be the same? AH equal to BH would imply A is an element of BH, which would imply there exists small h, an element of capital H, such that A is equal to BH, which would imply B inverse A is equal to H, an element of capital H. So if A is equal to BH, it turns out that B inverse A is an element of capital H. But the converse is also easy to show. If B inverse A is an element of capital H, it would imply that A is an element of BH, or the coset BH, which would imply AH is a subset of BH. But B inverse A is an element of capital H would imply A inverse B, which is the inverse of B inverse A, is also an element of capital H. So that would mean BH is a subset of AH. So we have AH is a subset of BH and BH is a subset of AH. So these two would imply AH is equal to BH. So the converse follows over here, and we get AH is equal to BH if and only if B inverse A is an element of H. So if we consider this to be a sort of a relation, like B is related to A if H is equal to BH, or equivalent to B inverse A is an element of H, it indicates that we can get something like an equivalence relation. So let's check it out. suppose A and B are element, we say A is equivalent to B if and only if H is equal to BH. It's easy to see that H is equal to H, it's well defined. H equal to BH would imply BH equal to H, yes, as sets. And H equal to BH and BH is equal to CH would imply H is equal to CH because it's an equality sign. So indeed, this turns out to be an equivalence relation. But our question is, what are the equivalence classes? If we look closely, it turns out that they are the cosets. So if A is equivalent to B, then A is an element of the coset BH, because A is an element of AH, so A is an element of BH. So basically, these cosets are the equivalent classes. That is, A and B are equivalent if and only if they belong to the same coset of H. But again, what's interesting over here is this time all the equivalence classes have the same size. Consider the bijection from H to H. H is the coset of H, as f small h is equal to A times small h. This turns out to be a bijection. Fh1 is equal to Fh2 if and only if H1 is equal to H2, which is if and only if H1 is equal to H2 by cancellation law. Again, this thing by definition is a surjective function. So we have something over here. So all our work shows that the size of H and H turn out to be the same. There is a bijection between them. So suppose they are finite. Does it tell you something? Yes, it does. So now we have a beautiful result called the Lagrange's theorem. Lagrange's theorem states that let G be a finite group and H be a subgroup of G. Suppose the number of cosets of H in G is in the index of H in G. This notation means the index of H in G. Then G, the size of G is basically the size of H times the index of H in G. This is pretty easy to see by whatever we did before. As cosets are of equal sizes and form a partition, this immediately follows. Note, as I said, G colon H inside third bracket is called the index of H in G. So we have two beautiful corollaries over here. The first one is let G be a finite group and H be a subgroup of G, then the order of H, the size of H divides the order of G or the size of G. This immediately follows from Lagrange's theorem, as mod G is basically a multiple of mod H by the index. I hope you remember the result that the order of any element divides the order of the group. We used some manipulation of the standard proof that the order of an element is well defined in a finite group to derive this result. But now with Lagrange's theorem, this result becomes pretty simple. Just consider the cyclic group generated by A. Its order turns out to be order of small a. But place this cyclic group in corollary 1, which immediately follows from the theorem. Indeed, this proof is far more elegant than a very bashy proof back then. So just look at it once and we'll proceed now. And that would say that the order of H would divide order of G, but order of H is the order of small a. So order of small a divides the order of G. And we are done. Indexes satisfy a very beautiful property over here called multiplicativity. So what is multiplicativity? It says that suppose K is a subgroup of H which itself is a subgroup of G. This would also say that K is a subgroup of G, right? As we had seen in the assignments. Then one can show that the index of K in G is basically the product of index of H in G and the index of K in H. So basically, if we think of it as fractions, which is what motivated by the Lagrange's theorem, we get G by K is equal to G by H times H by K. So the H factor gets cancelled out. We now present a proof for the finite case using Lagrange's theorem. Think of a proof about the infinite case. Of course, you can't use Lagrange's theorem now because Lagrange's theorem is valid whenever G is finite. But if these indexes are finite, it turns out that the infinitude of G doesn't affect this property. So if G is finite, it turns out that the size of G is basically the index of K in G times the size of K by Lagrange's theorem, and it is also equal to the index of H in G times the size of H. But K is a subgroup of H, So use Lagrange's theorem again. So size of H turns out to be the index of K in H times the size of K. But K is finite. As G is finite, K turns out to be finite. So simply remove the K factors. So we get that index of K in G is equal to index of H in G times the index of K in H as desired. So the infinite case would be a part of the exercise. Just think about it once now if you want to by pausing the video. Now, till now we had been dealing with left cosets, that is the element on the left side of the subgroup. What about right cosets or the element on the right side of the subgroup? Intuitively, it's, as I said, elements on the right side of the elements of the subgroups. So HA is equal to small ha, says the small h is an element of capital H. This is a right coset of H. So for every element in the group, we can define a right coset. Now, similar to our fact in left coset, it turns out that HA is a subgroup if and only if A is an element of capital H. In fact, here HA is equal to HB if and only if AB inverse is an element of H. Over there it was A inverse B or B inverse A is an element of H. Over here it's AB inverse is an element of H. Now Lagrange's theorem again holds for right cosets, because over there we are considering the equivalence relation, and indeed again right cosets turn out to be equivalence relations with partitions being the cosets. We now wish to show that the set of left cosets and the set of right cosets are bijective. First of all, note that they are not necessarily the same. If you look at the left coset and right coset of the group capital Y in S3, if you remember our example, then you'd realize that they are not the same. If the group is abelian, it turns out they are same. But think of other examples as well in which they are not the same. But it turns out that they are bijective. That is, if they are finite, they are of the same size or have the same number of elements, and if they are infinite, they are of the same cardinality. So let's look at how we can show this. So consider a map X to X inverse. Use this map to show that this set, the set of left cosets and the set of right cosets, is a bijection. This map actually takes any left coset GH, small g times capital H, to the right coset capital H G inverse. But the identity map is not something which will solve our problem. This is the best map or the simplest map which does it. So with this fact established that the right cosets and left cosets are bijective even if not the same, we shall only be considering left cosets when we shall be writing just cosets. If we are considering both left and right, or we are considering right, we shall be specifically mentioning right, and if it's just mentioned cosets, it means left cosets. So let's carry on. So here we have an example. If H is equal to 3Z, a subgroup of G equal to Z, the set of integers, the cosets of H in G are basically 3Z, 3Z plus 1 and 3Z plus 2. Clearly these partition G. So all our study was indeed correct. This verifies it and also gives you an idea. In fact, for abelian groups, it turns out that these are also right cosets. So left cosets and right cosets are the same. But what about non-abelian group? As I said, look for an example in S3 and you will find out that all left cosets are not necessarily right cosets. Now we revisit the normal subgroups once. Let G be a group and H be a subgroup. Then the following conditions are equivalent. H is a normal subgroup of G. Every right coset of G is a left coset. Specifically, GH is equal to HG for each G belonging to G. So we look at these properties once and now prove the equivalence. Note that 1 is equivalent to 3 is not hard to see, right? It's basically somewhat similar to the definition. And 3 would imply 2 is also easy, because if 3 is there, then every left coset is basically the right coset of the same element, that is H is equal to HA. So let's consider 2 implies 3 and then briefly study 3 implies 1. We now show 2 implies 3. Let A be an element of G. Clearly AH is equal to HB for some B belonging to G. We claim that HA is equal to HB. If AH is equal to HB, which is what 2 says, then HA is equal to HB, and that would simply say H is equal to HA and we are done. clearly A belongs to AH, which is equal to HB, and A belongs to HA, right? Now the cosets are basically, right, cosets are partitions. So if HB and HA has non-empty intersection, that is A, and they have the same size, it turns out that HA is equal to HB, and we are done. So hence HA is equal to HB is true, and HB is equal to AH by 2, hence AH is equal to HA, and we are done. It was pretty simple, but just go through it once. We now discuss 3 implies 1. Even though it's pretty obvious, but a pretty naive mistake over here is to take G inverse on the right hand side and we get G inverse is equal to H. That's incorrect. What we'll get is G inverse is a subset of H over there. So we have to show the reverse inclusion as well. So let's see. Let G be an element of capital G, then 3 implies GH, the element G small h, is an element of capital H times G, because G capital H is equal to capital HG, so G small h, which is an element of G capital H, is also an element of capital HG for all H. This is true. So GH G inverse belongs to H for all H. So G capital H G inverse is basically a subgroup. It's a group, we know it. It's a subgroup of G, we know it, and it turns out it's a subgroup of H as well. But G was arbitrary, right? Then setting G to G inverse, we get G inverse HG is a subgroup of H. But this turns out to be the equivalent of H is a subgroup of GH G inverse. How? Just think about it once. A hint over here would be considering conjugation action on subgroups. Hence, GH G inverse is equal to H, and we are done. So we need to be a bit careful over here when we are doing this. An obvious corollary of the previous slide, or rather the proposition in the previous slide, is the following. A subgroup H of G is normal in G if and only if GH G inverse is a subgroup of H for all G belonging to G. So instead of the equality sign, even if we have a subgroup sign over here for all G belonging to G, it turns out that H is normal in G. Try to prove it on your own using the results and the method of proof in the previous slide, as this is a very useful characterization of normal groups and might be or shall be used later on. So now we studied about cosets as a partition of G. But can cosets under our group operation behave like a group? Not always, actually. However, in our abelian cases and most of the cases, it turns out yes, it indeed is a group. For example, in our example of Z, 3z plus 1 and 3z plus 2, it's basically the same as Z3, the modular group. So 3z is equal to the class 0, 3z plus 1 is equal to the class 1, and 3z plus 2 is equal to the class 2, and we can use group operations over there. So what about a general setup? Let us assume that H is normal and proceed. Then AHBH is basically this set, but H is normal, so H1B is equal to BH3 because BH, it turns out that B inverse H1B is an element of H because B inverse capital HB is equal to H as H is normal. So this B inverse H1B is an element of B inverse capital HB, and it's also an element of H by definition. So suppose that element is H3, so it turns out that H1B is equal to BH3 for some H3 element of H. But if we set H is equal to H3 H2, which is also an element of H by closure, it turns out that AHBH is a subset of ABH such that H belongs to H, which is equal to ABH, the coset ABH. This isn't hard to see. Now what about the converse? Again, ABH is basically A1 times BH. But A1 is a subset of H, so this thing is a subset of H times BH. Hence, ABH is equal to HBH, as we have both inclusions over here. So operation is closed. And next we think about inverses. A inverse H, A inverse capital H is equal to capital H A inverse because GH is equal to HG for normal groups. But capital H is capital H inverse as a group. because if H is an element of H, then H inverse is also an element of H. And if H inverse is an element of H, then H is an element of H. Because by involution law, H inverse of inverse is equal to H. So this is basically H inverse A inverse by inverse law is H whole inverse. So it turns out that the inverse coset of H inverse is basically A inverse H, which is also coset. So inverses are well defined. Now H can be considered to be an identity. And again you can verify that A inverse H times AH is equal to capital H. So this identity concept and inverse concepts are again verified. So indeed, if H is normal, it turns out that G by H, the set of cosets, is a group under the same operation. What about the converse? Well, in fact, it is true, but it would require some work, and you can check the appendix which will be posted after this video for the proof of it. This group G by H under the same operation when H is normal is called the quotient group of G over H. We are basically quotienting out H or taking mod H. An example over here, verbal one, would be Zn is basically quotienting out nz out of z, or it's a quotient group of z over nz. We'll see more in the assignment. So now let's look at some possible converses of Lagrange's theorem. All the finite examples which we have done suggest that Lagrange's theorem has a direct converse. In abelian groups, it indeed does that. If n divides the order of G, then there is a subgroup of order n. But in the general framework, this isn't true actually. It's hard to think of examples right now, or counter examples rather right now, because we haven't done a lot of non-abelian groups. But once you do, and there is something called alternating groups and such concepts, you'll realize that this isn't true. So without further analysis or without further thinking, we state three close to converses of this theorem without proof. One of them shall be proved in the exercises, and the other two are just for your perusal. So theorem 1, this is due to Cauchy and also called Cauchy's theorem. Let G be a group and P be a prime dividing its order. Then there exists an element A of G of order P. So this seems to be simple and quite convincing, and indeed it's true, but would require some work to prove it. A result stronger than this one is due to Sylow. The general Sylow's theorem is a bit huge, and it's one of the most beautiful results in fundamental group theory. But we look at a simplified form over here. Let G be a group and O equal to P power L be the largest power of prime P dividing the order of G. It's the largest power, so P power L plus 1 does not divide G. Then there exist exactly n subgroups of G of order O, which is equal to P power L, where n is some number satisfying P divides n minus 1. As P divides n minus 1 and P divides 0, so it turns out that n can never be 0, because P cannot divide n minus 1 if n is equal to 0, as P is a prime and P is greater than 2 or equal to maybe. So this is a very beautiful and strong result, as it also gives us exactly how many such elements are there. In fact, for Cauchy's theorem also, you can determine some properties about how many elements, or a rough idea of how many such elements are possible. But Sylow's theorem, or many call it Sylow's theorem, is far stronger than Cauchy's theorem. In fact, we can also generalize Cauchy's theorem a bit using Sylow's theorem. So let G be a group and O equal to P power L be some power of a prime P such that O divides the order of G. Then there exists a subgroup of G of order O. Exactly how many can be determined combinatorially a bit, but we won't be dealing with it. But there exists at least one. So these three results can be thought of as some converses to Lagrange's theorem. But note that the general converse, that whenever a number divides the order, there is a subgroup of that order, is not true. So we now go to our next section about linking, and now understand what isomorphism means in the context of groups, and also study about other methods of linking. Till now, we have looked at how we can compare two groups by size or by the nature, or pack two groups in a larger group. For example, the direct product, which was discussed in the appendix. Now, let us look at how we can compare two groups by linking them, similar to functions which were used to link two sets in set theory. So, two ways of linking them are homomorphisms and isomorphisms. Let us study them. Let G and H be two groups with their operations star and circle respectively. So a function f from G to H is called a homomorphism if f of x star y is equal to f of x circle f of y for all x comma y belonging to G. So basically this function is respecting the fact that there exists an additional structure to the domain and also the codomain, and also supporting it by giving this multiplicative form and splitting of the function. So what does this tell over here? F of x star y, this is the group operation inside, that is f of xy is equal to fx. So fx is the image of just x, and that is an element of h, and fy is an element of h which is the image of y. These two, when operate inside H to give some, say, Z in H, that Z is basically the same as f of x star y or f of xy, where xy is the element of G by closure. So this is what we call a homomorphism in group theory. This not only respects the fact that the domain and codomain are groups, but also respects the multiplication of them, but also preserves the multiplication. In general, when we deal with algebraic structures or related things, if a function is said to be a compatible link or maybe an operation if it respects the additional structure given to an algebraic object. So that's what it's doing over here. F, our homomorphism is a compatible link because it's respecting the fact that the domain and codomain are groups and also preserving the multiplication. Similar to a set theoretic function, a homomorphism can be surjective or injective or bijective. So if fx is equal to fy implies x equal to y, it's injective. Similarly, for all small h and capital H, there exists a small g in capital G as fg is equal to h, then f is called surjective. And if both of these properties hold, it's called bijective. A bijective homomorphism is called an isomorphism. This is a very special type of homomorphism. It's bijective and it says a lot about the two groups. We will soon see what it says about the two groups. In case F is an inclusive map, I hope you remember, suppose G is a subset of H or a subgroup of H rather, then that map from G to H, which is inclusive and also respects the fact that the multiplication of the operation is the same, we call it an inclusion. So let's look at some examples over here. G equal to Z plus, the additive group of integers, and H is equal to Q plus, the additive group of rational numbers. Then F defined from G to H as any element Z, any integer Z goes to Z as a rational number is an inclusive homomorphism. Why? G is the subgroup of H and F is basically an inclusion map. It is respecting the fact that both of G and H are groups, as f of x plus y turns out to be x plus y, which is equal to fx plus fy, right? So let's look at a few more examples. With same sets G and H, we can have other homomorphisms which are not inclusive maps. Let's look at few of them. F1 is defined as it sends Z, an integer Z, to the image Z by 2. So why is this a homomorphism? First of all, f of x plus y is equal to x plus y whole by 2. This is x by 2 plus y by 2 by properties of fraction. But x by 2 is f1 of x and y by 2 is f1 of y. So f1 of x plus y is equal to f1 of x plus f1 of y. Hence, it's not only a function which can be proven easily, it's also a homomorphism. Moreover, if you look at it closely, it turns out to be injective as well. So let's look at another one. Z goes to 1729Z. Similar logic says that F2 is a homomorphism. Finally, look at this example F3. Over here, each z in integer is mapped to 0. This is interesting. This is the first homomorphism which is not injective. In fact, it is a constant. But this is a homomorphism as f3 of x plus y is equal to 0, which is the same as f3 of x plus f3 of y. So we have an interesting homomorphism, and this last homomorphism can exist between any two random sets. The operation doesn't matter, the set doesn't matter, and the group. So we know that given any two groups GH, we can come up with a homomorphism as f G goes to identity of H for all G. This homomorphism is called the trivial map, and it's always a homomorphism. Two groups involved. Over here, they had a similar structure. What was that? One was a subgroup of the other, and the operation hence was same. But what if the operation is different or the groups are different? That's quite possible. Let's look at two examples. Firstly, consider the additive group of integers as G and H as the multiplicative group of rational numbers. Note that f defined as z goes to 2 power z is a well-defined function from integers to multiplicative rational numbers, as 2 power z is always a rational number when z is an integer. Moreover, it turns out that f of x plus y, as plus is the operation in z, we said f of x plus y is equal to 2 power x plus y, which is equal to 2 power x times 2 power y in integers. But 2 power x is equal to fx and 2 power y is equal to fy. So f of x plus y is equal to fx times fy. But in the image set, our operation is cross. So the circle which we used in the definition is replaced by cross over here, or times. So indeed, this is a homomorphism. Some related terminologies. So now we look at some related terminologies. So let G and H be two groups and f G to H be a homomorphism. The inverse image of a subset S of H, where H is the group, it's a subset, not necessarily a group over here, or a subgroup, is F inverse S, which is defined as G belonging to G, such that the image of G lies in S, or Fg belongs to S. This is pretty easy to see, and this is basically the set theoretic definition. No additional property of group is being used in this definition. In general, we say the fiber of F over H belonging to H, which is the fiber of the homomorphism of an element of H, is basically F inverse H, or the set H, singleton set. Now, can you show that the fibers are basically cosets of kernel F? This isn't hard to see as such, but would require some work. Again, try it out. Finally, the image of f is defined as the range of f. So f is a function first of all because it's a homomorphism. Its range is called the image. So it's defined as IMF, which is defined as fg, the notation for image, which is equal to all s in capital H such that f inverse of that set is not phi, or there is some g such that fg is equal to s. A good exercise at this point would be to check that IMF and curf are indeed subgroups of H and G respectively. Try it out once. We will be showing it for kernel F, but image F would be left as an exercise. So here is a very strong proposition. Earlier we hinted that kernel and image are indeed subgroups of their respective groups. But here we claim something stronger. We claim that the kernel is a normal subgroup of C. So let's prove it. Firstly, if f1 is equal to a, then a square is equal to f1 square, which is equal to f1 times f1, which is equal to f1 times 1, which is equal to f1, which is equal to a. So a square is equal to a. So by cancellation law, a is equal to 1. So 1 is in the kernel. 1 of G is in the kernel of f. Now suppose A and B are in the kernel, then FAB is equal to FA times FB by definition of homomorphism. But FA is equal to 1 each and FB is also equal to 1 each. So this product is equal to 1 each. So FAB is equal to 1 each. But that means AB is in the kernel. So indeed AB is closed under operation. If A is in the kernel, we prove that A inverse is also in the kernel, as if A inverse is equal to FA inverse times FA, as A is in the kernel, FA is the identity of H. So this thing given over here is indeed true. But by definition of homomorphism, this is FA inverse times A. This is equal to F1, which we have already proved over here to be 1. This fact is in fact general. Over here we considered A to be in the kernel, but indeed you can show that even if A is not in the kernel, then f of G inverse is equal to the inverse of Fg in H. So this G inverse is in G, and f of G inverse, Fg is the image of G, this is an element of H, and this is the inverse of Fg in H. This is true for all G belonging to G. Try it out. It's similar to the proof given over here. Finally, if A belongs to Ker F and G belongs to G, f of GA-G inverse, this element GA-G inverse, is equal to Fg times Fa times Fg inverse, correct? Which is equal to Fg times 1 times Fg's inverse. Over here it was f of G inverse. This is the inverse of Fg. These two are different, but actually the same in a homomorphism. So this thing is equal to 1. So we are done, as if A is an element of the kernel and G is an element of the group, then the image of GA-G inverse is equal to 1. So GA-G inverse belongs to the kernel of F for all G, as G wasn't fixed over here, it was arbitrary. This is same as G Ker F G inverse is a subset of Ker F, or rather subgroup of Ker F. So Ker F is normal. I hope you remember this condition for normality given in the previous slide. This is indeed very essential, as most of the times this is the characterization of normal groups which we use, as this is easier to show. But what about the converse? That is, over here we showed that every kernel of a homomorphism is normal. Is every normal subgroup of G kernel of some homomorphism? Think of quotient groups once. We'll also prove it in the appendix. Some additional properties of homomorphisms are here. Firstly, note that by chain multiplication, f of a power n is equal to f of a whole power n. So basically a power n is the operation result in the domain, and fa whole power n is the operation result in the codomain. So this is true, and it's not hard to see. You can use induction to prove this. So this is true for all n belonging to Z, not only for positive rational numbers, which follows directly from induction, but also for negative rational numbers. We have already seen this for n equal to -1, so again induction can be ensued over here. If two elements of G are conjugate, then the image is also conjugate. Let's look at it. Suppose B is equal to AG. Suppose B is equal to GAG inverse, then FB is equal to FG times FA times FG inverse. But if FG is Y, this is the same as Y FA Y inverse. We just saw that F of G inverse is the same as the inverse of FG. So FB is equal to Y FA Y inverse. That implies FB is a conjugate of FA. So if two elements are conjugates, the images are also conjugates. There is a natural bijection between cosets of Ker F and the image set. I had already asked you to show that the fibers are basically some cosets of the kernel, and now the kernel is normal, so left coset or right coset doesn't matter. Indeed, show that this is a bijection, that is, the cosets of Ker F and the image set, these lie in a bijection. So indeed, by Lagrange's theorem, you can show that size of Ker F times the size of MF is indeed equal to the size of the group if the size of the group is finite. This is a pretty beautiful result, and we'll prove it in the assignment. Suppose order of A is finite. Then using the first property over here, that is Fa power n is equal to Fa whole power n, you can show that Fa divides the order of A. Now extending the proof that kernel F is a subgroup, one can show that F inverse of H prime is a subgroup of G for all H prime subgroup of H. So inverse maps of subgroups are subgroups. Similarly, the direct maps, that is F of G prime for a subgroup G prime of G is a subgroup. So the direct map of subgroups are subgroups in the MH set. These are pretty useful results. Try to prove them by yourself. We have already hinted for kernel how we can proceed. Now think about the general H prime. The proof is quite similar. Now previously we said that injective homomorphisms are injective functions which also behave as homomorphisms. But in the case of set theory, we saw that injective functions behave really well. In fact, if we restrict the codomain to the range of the function, injective functions can be easily converted to bijective functions, which are invertible. So, with a similar logic, the study of injective homomorphisms become important and are usually done along with the study of isomorphisms. We shall see soon. As we stated, an isomorphism is a bijective homomorphism. When there is an isomorphism F from G to H, we say G is isomorphic to H. But why are we doing this? We never say that a group is homomorphic to another group. In fact, we showed that any two groups have a homomorphism between them. So does this tell that two groups might not have an isomorphism between them? Yeah, this is quite obvious. As isomorphisms are bijective, both of them, if finite, should be of the same size, and if infinite, should be of the same cardinal. We haven't talked about the cardinal numbers or ordinal numbers, but it basically compares different types of infinities. You might have read that in countability and uncountability. So, why are we saying that G is isomorphic to H? Now, suppose G and H have the same size. If you have gone through the appendix, we have discussed a group of size 4 which is not cyclic. In fact, there are finite groups like S3 which we discussed in the example, which has a size of 6 but is not cyclic and not abelian as well. Indeed, motivation says that they must have the same structure as a function is respecting the fact that there is a multiplication and also preserving it, and also at the same time is bijective. So it's basically renaming the elements as well as the multiplication. So we'll look at the motivation a bit later. So now we represent G is isomorphic to H as G is congruent to H, this sign. We shall soon show that it is an equivalence relation that would justify our specific nomenclature that G is isomorphic to H. Indeed, there are groups which are not isomorphic but of the same size, or many other things. So these are a few equivalent conditions for injective homomorphism. F is an injective homomorphism. The kernel of F is just the identity. Identity belongs to the kernel of F. You already know because kernel of F is a subgroup and subgroups are never empty. And identity was there. But if it's the singleton identity, then F is an injective homomorphism. And Fx equal to Fy if and only if x is equal to y. So 3 and 1 are basically by definition. But what about 2? Try it out. This is a very good exercise to check whether you understand the concept of kernel and homomorphism. I would request you to pause the video if required and try this out by yourself. If the doubt persists, I'll clear it out during the question answer session. To show that a homomorphism is an isomorphism, we shall find the image set and show that it's the same as the codomain and also evaluate the kernel. And if the kernel is just the identity, it's injective and we are done. Some examples. Let G is equal to Z plus and H is equal to A, where OA is equal to undefined. So basically A is an element of undefined order So H is equal to A has infinite elements. We claim that G and H are isomorphic. Consider the map Z to A power Z. The power is an exponentiation of group elements. I hope you remember it. So fx plus y, as I said earlier, is equal to a power x plus y is equal to a power x times a power y, which is equal to fx fy. So f is indeed a homomorphism, not just a function but also a homomorphism. But by definition, a simple restatement of the fact what h is, it turns out that f is also surjective. Finally, let's look at the kernel. As order of A is undefined, it turns out that the kernel over here is equal to just the identity or a power 0. So kernel f is equal to 1 each as order of A is undefined. Indeed, f is injective as well. So f is a homomorphism which is surjective and injective. So indeed, f is an isomorphism and G and H are isomorphic. So any two infinite cyclic groups are isomorphic. Why? An infinite cyclic group is isomorphic to Z plus. The second one is also isomorphic to Z plus. And we shall soon show that isomorphism is an equivalence relation. So it's transitive and symmetric. So that would imply those two infinite cyclic groups are isomorphic. Similarly, any two finite cyclic groups are isomorphic. Why? G is equal to Zn plus and H is equal to A, where order of A is equal to N. These two turn out to be isomorphic. This is relatively easier to show, and once our previous facts have been established, this becomes a piece of cake for you. Next, the multiplicative groups of roots of unity. Why is this a group? Check it out, it was a part of the previous assignment. Is isomorphic to this group given over here. A group similar to this was given in the assignment. It's basically all positive, or rather all non-negative rational numbers lesser than 1, and the addition is the fractional part operation. So it turns out that this is also a group with 0 as the identity. So try to prove that there exists an isomorphism between omega and our special group over here. This would also be a part of your assignment, but you can try it whenever you're free. Firstly, note that in G, identity G from G to G defined as an element G goes to G, the same element, is an isomorphism, right? This is very easy to show as GH is equal to FGFH, which is equal to FGH. And also it's by definition a bijection as it's an identity map. So indeed, G is isomorphic to G. So our isomorphism relation, if we coin it a relation term, if we give it a term that it's a relation, is indeed reflexive. An interesting point over here is there might be other isomorphism from G to G. Any such isomorphism defined from a set to itself, or rather a group to itself, is called an automorphism. So more study, very basic level, is given in the appendix. So you can go through it if you want to. Now suppose f from G to H is an isomorphism. Now the facts given over here say that f inverse, since f is a bijection, G is equal to f inverse is also a bijective map. Moreover, it turns out that these two are identity by the alternative characterization of a bijective map and inverse. Also, for x and y belonging to H, the set of operations given over here imply that G is also an isomorphism. It's a bijective, we already know. We just need to prove that it's a homomorphism. And that's what we prove over here. Just go through it once. So once we are ready, what we just did says that if G is isomorphic to H, that's true if and only if H is isomorphic to G. And this is the condition for our isomorphic relation to be symmetric. Finally, what remains is to show that it's transitive. So suppose G is isomorphic to H and H is isomorphic to P with respect to F and F dash respectively. So F is an isomorphism from G to H and F dash is an isomorphism from H to P. Then if the composition G is defined as F dash composite F and xy are elements of G. First of all, G is a bijection, right? Because it's a composition of two bijections. Moreover, Gxy turns out to be Gx times Gy by this chain of equalities. Hence, it is a homomorphism and it's a bijection, so it's an isomorphism. Indeed, it turns out that a relation of isomorphism is transitive as well. So it was already reflexive and symmetric, now it's also transitive. Hence, we conclude that our isomorphism relation was indeed an equivalence relation. So now let's go a bit back and look at the motivation and intuition behind isomorphism being an equivalence relation and also why it's so important. Two groups are isomorphic if and only if they behave similarly with their structure. Homomorphism is something which keeps track of the structure and preserves the multiplication. Moreover, if it's isomorphic, it also has the same size and also same behavior per se as its bijective. So what we have over here is a similarity not only in the structure of the set but also in the overall algebraic structure or the structure of the set, the elements and the operation between the elements. So that is why earlier when we said that two sets are bijective, if the elements are a renaming of each other, over here they are isomorphic if the element as well as the operation. So in total the group is a renaming of the other group. So studying one group is enough to derive properties of the other group. This is very important and this is where classification comes to a play. So basically H and G are isomorphic. Look, as we have already proved that it's symmetric and an equivalence relation, I didn't say H is isomorphic to G. I said H and G are isomorphic. It's the same thing. So H and G are isomorphic. Then studying H is enough to study G. They have a similar structure in terms of set, in terms of elements, and also in terms of operation. Indeed, the main objective of studying group theory, the theoretical part of it, is to study one element of each isomorphism class and also to find how many or what type of isomorphism classes are possible under other constraints. For example, give me size 4. We have already seen that there is a cyclic group of size 4, also that is Z4. Also, if you have gone through the appendix, Z2 cross Z2 turns out to be cyclic. Z2 cross Z2, the Klein 4 group, is not cyclic but also of size 4. So we have two types of groups, two different structures, although the size is same and the sets might exist in bijection, but the groups will not exist in isomorphism as they have different structure. Are there any other structure possible for size 2? The simple answer is no. We'll see that in the assignment, but let me give a hint to you. Suppose G is a group of size 4, then A is the element with the largest order in G. If A has an order 4, then it has to be cyclic because the cyclic group generated by A has 4 elements and it's a subgroup of G, so it has to be G itself. So what all possibilities are there? A can have an order of 2, it can't have an order of 3 because the order of A must divide the order of the group by Lagrange's theorem. So order of A is equal to 2, but identity has order 1 and all other elements have order greater than 1. So that would imply the other two elements also have an order 2 because A's order is the maximum. So that's the Klein 4 group and we are done. So I'd recommend you go through what I said once again if you still have doubt, and also try to prove that indeed if all elements have order 2 except the identity and the group size of the group is 4, then that group has a structure similar to the Klein 4 group. So with this reasoning that two groups are isomorphic if they behave exactly the same way, one may understand and prove the following more rigorously. Suppose G is isomorphic to H with respect to F, then order of G is equal to order of H and order of any element A is equal to order of the image of that element. G is abelian if and only if H is abelian. F of the center of G is the center of H. So set of all commuting elements in G is the set of all commuting elements is H just by renaming by F. Just the difference is that it is being renamed. So F maps all the elements with the property of it being commutative to H. G is finitely generated or cyclic if and only if H is finitely generated or cyclic. So if G is finitely generated, then H is finitely generated and vice versa. And if G is cyclic, then H is cyclic and vice versa. The cyclic part has already been proven to some extent. We have shown it for infinite cyclic groups, and the finite group proof is similar, but still go through it once. So before we proceed further, let's summarize what we did. We studied special subgroups like normalizers, normal subgroups, centralizers, and the center of a group. We defined conjugate elements, not just elements, but conjugate subgroups as well, and studied their properties. We dealt with cosets of subgroups and the behavior of the index of a coset. And by studying it, we came to a beautiful conclusion, that is Lagrange's theorem, and also stated three possible converses of Lagrange's theorem. Not the verbatim converse, but somewhat a converse, close to a converse of Lagrange's theorem. Those were the Cauchy's theorem, the P-Silos theorem, or the Silos theorem as we stated, and finally the generalized Cauchy's theorem. Next, we came to homomorphisms and isomorphisms and ways to link two groups, not just as sets but as groups. Finally, we studied kernel and images along with some examples and properties of homomorphisms, isomorphisms, kernels, and images. So now we proceed to the final part of the lecture, and this might be the part which many of you were waiting eagerly to see right from the beginning. That is, what are the applications of group theory, or how we can apply group theory to known fields. You know a bit of number theory, we will now see how number theory becomes a bit simple, not the whole of it. Some elementary number theoretic theorems become so simple with our structure, with whatever we did in group theory. So we arrive at the final part of our lecture. Over here, we will be using group theory to study number theory and prove some famous theorems using the results which we have obtained. So let's start by recalling modular groups. Again, if A, B, C, D are integers and n is a natural number, we say A is congruent to B mod n if and only if n divides A minus B. We had already seen that congruent mod n is an equivalence relation. Also, if A is congruent to B mod n and C is congruent to D mod n, we have A plus C is congruent to B plus D mod n and AC is congruent to BD mod n. Now, let's come to division. If A comma n is equal to 1, that is the GCD of A and n is 1, then there exists some x in the integer set such that AX is congruent to 1 mod n. Such an A, where A comma n is equal to 1 or A has an inverse, is called a unit or invertible. Division by such an element makes sense, as division by A is the same as multiplication by x. Now let's once again look at the standard residue classes. Zn, the set of all remainders mod n, is a group under the restricted sense of addition modulo n. That is, R1 plus R2 is equal to itself if it's less than n, otherwise it's R1 plus R2 minus n. So this is called the set of remainder classes or residue classes modulo n. It is not a group under multiplication because 0 is there, and even if 0 was not there and n is not a prime, n would have a divisor and that is not invertible. But it's a group under addition. Also, a subset of this group, or rather a subset of this set Zn, called Zn star, defined as a set of units, is the set of all units as the name suggests. R comma n is equal to 1. So this is actually a group modulo n. This is what was a part of the assignment and was also indicated in the last class. This is called the group of units of Zn or reduced residue class modulo n. This is a group in its own right? Because as you had seen in the assignment or was hinted in the last class, it's a group under multiplication with 1 as the identity. But note that it's not a subgroup of Zn, as Zn is a group with addition and Zn star is a group with multiplication. The operation differs. Now we denote the size of Zn star as phi n. This phi is a function because it's uniquely linked to a number for each n, and it's called the Euler-Tauschig function. This function has a few interesting properties. Let's look at two of them. Firstly, phi p is equal to p minus 1 for each prime p. It's very easy because if r is less than p and greater than 0, that is 1, 2, 3 dot 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 p minus 1, then r comma p, that is GCD, is equal to 1, and it's only p if r is equal to 0. That's why phi p turns out to be p minus 1. Phi p power n can be shown to be p power n minus 1 times p minus 1. This is again simple. Any number whose GCD with p power n is greater than 1 is actually divisible by p. So how many numbers are lesser than p power n and non-negative and divisible by p? Exactly p power n minus 1 times p minus 1. Hence our answer is correct. So we have evaluated phi for all integers of the form p power n. So now later we'll give a hint to prove that if m comma n is equal to 1, then phi mn is equal to phi m times phi n. So phi is said to be multiplicative over here if it satisfies this property. Note that if m comma n is not equal to 1, this multiplication law might not hold. The GCD1 or the co-primeness is necessary over here. So we can indeed compute the size pretty easily. Let's consider for Z1001 star, phi 1001 is equal to phi 7 into 11 into 13. By multiplicity, this is phi 7 into phi 11 into phi 13. But phi 7 is 6, phi 11 is 10, and phi 13 is 12. So this turns out to be 720. So now let's look at a subgroup of the reduced residue class. Consider the function from Zn star to Zn star as r goes to r square modulo n. We take the remainder. Note that if r comma a is equal to 1, that's true if and only if r square comma a is equal to 1. If r square comma a has a common divisor greater than 1, then r comma a must also have a common divisor greater than 1. This follows from the fundamental theorem of arithmetic, which you might have done in the school. So this function is well defined, that is, the range is a part of the codomain and it's a function. Now note that fxy is equal to x square y square, which is equal to xy whole square, since Zn star is abelian, which is equal to fx times fy. I'm sorry, oh, you have missed that. As Zn star is abelian, so this property says that f is a homomorphism. Now image of f is equal to all units of Zn such that it's a square, or there exists some s inside Zn star such that s square is equal to r. This is a subgroup, as image is a subgroup, we have seen just a few moments back. So this is subgroup. This IMF is called the reduced residue class of quadratic nature, or the reduced quadratic residue class modulo n. Quadratic, why? Because it's the set of squares modulo n which are also units. The size of the reduced quadratic residue class can be determined using a bit of group theory. Let's look at it. Earlier we stated that there is a bijection between G by curve F and MF, and we have also proved this in the first isomorphism theorem, which has been discussed in the appendix. So IMF is equal to Zn star by curve F, which is equal to phi n by curve F. Now curve F can be evaluated for a specific n, right? It's not hard to see when the square is 1. So let's look at a few examples, and if we can evaluate curve F, we are done, as we know phi n already from the formulas, and we know curve F, we have IMF, and we know the size of the reduced residue class. And we know the size of the reduced quadratic residue class. So let us look at two examples. G is equal to Zn star. If n is an odd prime, then curve F is equal to r belonging to G, such that n divides r square minus 1, which is equal to r belonging to G such that n divides r minus 1 or n divides r plus 1. Why this? It's not hard to see, because n is a prime. So if n divides AB, then n divides A or n divides B. N can divide both of them, but n divides at least one of them. So it turns out that if n divides r minus 1, then r is equal to 1, because r is less than n and it's non-negative. And if n divides r plus 1, r is equal to n minus 1. So the only two elements in the kernel is 1 comma n minus 1. So IMF turns out to be p minus 1 by 2, as phi n is equal to n minus 1 or p minus 1 over here. So IMF turns out to be p minus 1 by 2 or n minus 1 by 2. Next, consider n is equal to 10. Then it turns out cur f is equal to 1 comma 9. This isn't hard to see, just evaluate it. The function, there are only 4 elements which have a GCD 1 with 10 and it's less than 10. Those are 1, 3, 7 and 9. 3 and 7 are not in the kernel because 3 square is equal to 9 and 7 square is also equal to 9 in Z10. The size of IMF is equal to phi 10 by 2, which is equal to 2. Phi 10 is 4 and it's 2. So this is how we compute the size of the reduced quadratic residue class. However, consider the special case where n is equal to p squared. It turns out it is just 0 union IMF. F is our initial homomorphism between Zn star and Zn star. So this is true. Now our concept can be generalized to higher powers like reduced cubic residue classes or general cubic residue classes and so on, and these can be used to solve Diophantine equations and some equations which you might be familiar from your courses in number theory or even if you have appeared for Olympiads. So now let's look at applications of Lagrange's theorem on G equal to Zn star to get a simple but beautiful result. You might have already seen this result. It's called the Euler's theorem. If GCD of A and n is 1, then A power phi n is 1 in Zn star, or A power phi n is congruent to 1 mod n. So how should we prove it? We prove an equivalence statement, which I said right now, that A power phi n is equal to 1. But phi n is basically the order of Zn star. So order of A divides order of the group. So order of A divides phi n. So that means A power phi n is equal to 1, and we are done. Look how simple this proof has become using group theory. There is a pure number theoretic proof to this fact as well, but it's a bit long. But with a bit of knowledge of group theory, this becomes very simple and quite trivial. So let's look at a corollary of this. This corollary was suggested by Fermat and it's called the Fermat's little theorem. If n is a prime, then for all A belonging to Z, A power n is congruent to A mod n. If A comma n is equal to 1, this is the same as A power n minus 1 is congruent to 1 mod n, as we know division makes sense, and that's what is a direct corollary of the theorem. What about A comma n is not equal to 1? That's an exercise for you. So let's look at another theorem. It's called the Wilson's theorem. This states that if P is a prime, then P minus 1 factorial is congruent to minus 1 mod P. In fact, the converse also holds, but the converse is pretty easy, right? Suppose P minus 1 factorial is congruent to minus 1 mod P. That means P does not divide P minus 1 factorial. But then, if P were not a prime, P would be A, B, and both A and B would occur in P minus 1 factorial, and then P would divide P minus 1 factorial. Hence, P is a prime. So write that formally, and that's an exercise for you. Now, if order of A is greater than 2, then A and A inverse are distinct, right? And occur separately in ZP star. So they cancel out in the product. This isn't hard to see, as suppose they were not distinct, then A is equal to A inverse would imply A square is equal to 1. That would imply order of A is equal to 1 or 2. And if they don't cancel out, that doesn't make sense. And if like A and A inverse are not unique, that contradicts the fact that ZP star is a group. I hope you remember the uniqueness of inverse and the involution law. Again, if order of A is equal to 1, that's only possible if A is the identity or A is equal to 1. So it has no contribution to the product. Finally, the only case left is order of A is equal to 2. Note that if order of A is equal to 2, it would be in the kernel of our F map. the F map between the reduced residue class and the quadratic reduced residue class, then A would belong to that set and A should not be 1 because 1 has an order of 1. So indeed, it turns out A is minus 1. We had studied for a prime P, what's the quadratic residue class and all. So in the kernel it was 1 and n minus 1 are over here P minus 1. So A is equal to minus 1. Hence the only non-cancelled term in the product is this minus 1. So everything cancels out except 1 minus 1. So the product turns out to be minus 1. And we are done. We'll see a generalization of this theorem and also some other facts in the homework. Let's revise the direct product a bit before we proceed. I hope you have gone through the homework. Over there, there was an exercise on the direct product, defining it and also proving that it's a group and some related questions. We have also discussed the direct product in Appendix A, or the appendix of the first lecture, which was on cyclic groups, finitely generated groups and direct products. I would urge you to go through it if you are free and if you want to know a bit more about group theory. Even if you haven't gone through, just note that with respect to the operations in the respective coordinates as done in the homework, G cross H is a group. So as in the appendix, we saw that Z2 cross Z2 is not cyclic. Indeed, Z2 cross Z2 has a property that all elements satisfy A square is equal to 1. So other than the identity, other elements have an order of 2. But our question is, when is Zm cross Zn cyclic? In the appendix, we have also seen that Z2 cross Z3 is cyclic, as 1, 1 generates it. So when is Zm cross Zn cyclic? This is a pretty interesting question, and this leads to what is known as the Chinese remainder theorem for number theory. It has a stronger form in ring theory, which we won't discuss right now. So our proposition over here is, if M and N are co-prime, then Zm cross Zn is isomorphic to Zm, but Zmn is cyclic. So if Mn is co-prime, then Zm cross Zn is cyclic. We consider the direct compatibility function, or sometimes this is called the canonical function. P from Zmn goes to Zm cross Zn as E goes to E mod n, E mod n. That it is a remainder in both of these groups. Simple modular computation will tell us that P is a homomorphism. It's not hard to see. Just use the facts in modular arithmetic, and as it's the canonical map, it is bound to be the homomorphism. As size of the domain and codomain are same, is equal to Mn. Showing it is injective is enough to prove that it is an isomorphism. But ker P is equal to E belonging to Zm, such that M divides E and N divides E, because both of the coordinates has to be 0. And first coordinate is 0 if E is divisible by M, and the second coordinate is 0 if E is divisible by N. So this, because M comma N is equal to 1, this would imply ker P is equal to E belonging to Zmn such that Mn divides E, because both of them are co-prime. But that's basically 0, the identity of Zmn. So P is injective as the kernel is just the identity, and this implies that P is an isomorphism. If you are not sure why this implies P is an isomorphism, just go through this proof, and if the doubt still persists, you can ask me in the doubt clearing session or rewind the video and visit the previous slides. Now a proposition, M comma N is equal to 1 if and only if Zm cross Zn is cyclic. The first part is pretty simple to see, that Zm cross Zn is cyclic if M comma N is equal to 1. That's what we just proved. What about the converse? That's a challenge problem for you. You can refer to the appendices, you can search it on the net. If you still have a doubt, you can ask me in the doubt clearing session, but I'd prefer if you try it on your own. It's not difficult to see if Zm cross Zn is cyclic, then M comma N is equal to 1. So now we come to the Chinese remainder theorem. If a1, a2, an are pairwise coprime integers, that is ai, aj is equal to 1 for all I not equal to j, and ri belonging to z integers satisfy that ri is non-negative and lesser than ai for each I, then the set of equations x is congruent to Ri mod Ai has a simultaneous solution. Our proof shall specifically be for the case n equal to 2. Rest is induction, right? Because it's a finite case and showing just for two things over here with our conditions is the same as showing for a finitely many of them. Try to use induction over there. Set m is equal to a1 and n is equal to a2 in our previous facts. So clearly the previous proposition says that the cyclicity 1, that there is an R belonging to Zmn such that P of R, P is our homomorphism between Zm cross Zm and Zmn, PR is equal to R1 comma R2. So what's R1? R1 is the thing given in the theorem, and R2 is also given to us, and M is equal to A1 over here and N is equal to A2. So Zmn is basically Z A1 A2, and our image set is Z A1 cross Z A2. But this R, instead of thinking it as an element of Zmn, can be thought of as an element of capital Z or integers. Just an integer less than m, which is also an element of Zmn, which leaves the remainder R when divided by mn. So this gives us an element R inside the integer such that this property holds, that its remainder with respect to a1 is r1 and its remainder with respect to a2 is r2. Hence our proof is complete. This is indeed a very beautiful result and a very strong result. The existence part, that the solution system of simultaneous equations has a solution. So go through it. It's not difficult once the cyclicity part has been established, and you will find myriad applications of this theorem in number theory and also in computer programming. So now let's look at some more interesting propositions. Few of these are a bit challenging, but if you are interested to do your project on group theory, these can be good options. So let's look at them. When is Zn star cyclic? This is a pretty interesting question. We had already hinted this, that we would give a hint at the end and so on at the first class, but I've decided not to give you a hint per se. I'll just tell you something. A very specific case when Zn star is cyclic is when n is equal to p. Can you show that if n is a prime then Zn star is cyclic? Now the next question, can we use p, that is a map between Zmn and Zm cross Zn, which we use to prove the cyclicity of Zm cross Zn when m comma n is equal to 1. We used to show whenever m comma n is 1, then Zmn star, that is the group of units, is also isomorphic to Zm star cross Zn star. This is a pretty interesting result, right? No doubt this is interesting, because it was a map in addition and it's also getting transferred to multiplication. This is what is called a ring homomorphism. When you later on do ring theory, this is not just a group homomorphism, this is a ring homomorphism. But right now, without considering that it's a ring homomorphism, try to prove this fact. Now this is another interesting question. Is phi an optimum, or is there a smaller function, smaller in the sense that lambda satisfy lambda n is less than equal to phi n for each n, and for some n lambda n is strictly less than phi n? This is what we mean by a smaller function. So is there a smaller function lambda satisfying a power lambda n? Lambda n over here is the function lambda operated on n, is congruent to 1 mod n for all a belonging to Zn star. So the question over here is that phi n does the work, but can we improve on phi n? Find another function which does a better work than phi n. It returns smaller integers such that the order property is surely satisfied. Now we state two results. If p is an odd prime, then p divides n square plus 1 for some integer n, if and only if 4 divides p minus 1. So p is of the form 4k plus 1. Use quadratic residue and Lagrange's theorem over here. So this result with a bit of Gaussian integers, if you know already about them, it's very good. And if you don't know, it would require some ring theory to do it properly. You can use those results to see and give a more elegant proof of Fermat's two-square theorem. It has a pure number theoretic proof and an analytical number theoretic proof, but it also has an algebraic number theoretic proof using group theory. That the theorem states that if p is an odd prime, then p is equal to the sum of two integer squares, if and only if p is of the form 4k plus 1, or 4 divides p minus 1. You can see that this divisibility property relates these two propositions, and indeed we use this proposition over here to prove this. But this is a bit high level. I just wanted to show you that how strong group theory is in the field of number theory. So that's it for today. So that was it for today, and let's summarize what we learned. We studied different types of special subsets like the centralizer, normalizer, center of a subgroup, and normal subgroups, and so on. We understood the concept of normal subgroups and studied about the properties of quotienting and some equivalent forms of defining normal subgroups. We defined cosets and indexes with properties. We saw the Lagrange's theorem and also studied possible inverses, just the statements. Next, we defined homomorphisms and isomorphisms as ways to link two groups, respecting that they are groups and also preserving the multiplication operation, and saw examples for them. Finally, we dealt with isomorphisms as equivalence relations. If you are interested to study more group theory, then these are a few topics which you might want to check out. First is the isomorphism theorems. These are some beautiful and short theorems which tell us about the behavior of homomorphisms and use them to induce some beautiful isomorphisms, and also tells a bit more about quotienting and rules of quotienting. You can check these, and the first isomorphism theorem, which is the most popular one, is provided in the appendix with the proof and also with applications. Next is group actions. This is how a group behaves and acts somewhat or operates on another set. This is perhaps the most important part of group theory, and it leads to many important results like the Syllo's theorems, Cauchy's theorem, and about orbit, centralizer, the class equation, and many. And one might say that after the first part is over, which we have already done, this is the next most important part and the part which is required for a further study in group theory. Next is Syllo's theorems and finite groups. Syllo's theorem is perhaps one of the most beautiful theorems in group theory, and as I had stated a part of it, it has many more parts which are based on group actions. So once you are through with group actions, you can check the proof, application, and also the different forms of Syllo's theorems and apply them to study finite groups. Next comes internal direct product and semi-direct products. So we have done external direct products. There is something called internal direct products, that is direct products of subgroups of a group. Go through it when it's defined, you can check it out. And a more important concept which comes after it is the semi-direct products. It is again related to the direct product, that is product of groups or some larger group in which both the groups involved are packed inside. But it's very important, and that actually tells us a lot about classification and would help us in the study of finite groups. Next comes solvability and chains. So solvability is a property of groups, and it's related to the normal subgroups present in that group, and we can define chains of solvable groups or chains of groups or quotients to describe a group. And in fact, these chains turn out to be unique for a group. So you can study that as well. And this is a bit advanced and would require some group actions and a better understanding of isomorphism theorems and so on. Finally, once you are a bit thorough with Syllo theorems, a study of finite groups semi-direct products, internal direct products, group actions, and isomorphism theorems, you can go on to study ring theory, vector spaces, module theory, field theory, Galois theory, and other branches of mathematics or branches of abstract or general algebra which require the concept of groups. So groups are perhaps a very fundamental algebraic structure, and it forms one of the pillars of algebra. So it's very important to understand them properly. There are also other topics like symmetry, some applications to matrices, learning representation theory, and so on, which would be easier and would also require group theory as well as some vector spaces and some linear algebra. But hopefully, whatever we discussed in this course would help you in these further studies. So next I shall be listing a few materials. You can pause that screen and note them down. These are for extra study. If you want to learn a bit more about group theory, or you are not sure about some paths which I discussed, these do contain group theory and other related topics of abstract and linear algebra in a very beautiful and understandable format. Also, there are a few materials for elementary number theory. You might be knowing them, but you can go through them if you haven't and if you want to. So thank you very much, and let's meet at the Q&A session.